Nurse Educators Now, brought to you by Collaborative Momentum Consulting. Today, our guest is Dr. Jan Jones-Schenk, an expert in competency-based education. Jan was the founding CNO and National Director of the Western Governors University College of Health Professions, and in that role, she was instrumental in the development and growth of WGU's nursing program that used competency-based education as a framework. I want to recommend to all of our listeners that you check out her article, Competency-Based Education, Coming to a Nursing Program Near You, in the Journal of Continuing Education. Jan, thanks so much for being with us. I really am looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Susie. Me too. This is a topic I love to talk about.
Well, I know you do, and I think our listeners will really enjoy it. So let me start with the first question that comes to my mind. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became involved in the development of a competency-based education for nursing students? What was the background?
Yeah, well, about 18 years ago, I accepted a position with Western Governors as a project director to develop a pre-licensure nursing program using competency-based model. And they had a master's program at the time. So they had begun moving down this path. And my background was not in nursing education. My background was as a nurse leader and a nurse administrator. So my knowledge about what needed to be done was really based on what I was seeing as a practice leader. And really, I had the benefit of not having, if you will, the constraints of tradition in my mind because I had not grown up as a nurse educator. So I think I was very intrigued by the whole idea of transforming learning and teaching away from seat time and lecture and synchronous learning and some of those traditions. And I had the great opportunity to work with Linda Burns Bolton and Marilyn Chow and Carol Bradley, who were also nurse leaders who were looking for ways not only to improve and transform nursing education, but also to use the systems to get greater scale. So, of course, during that time, as in my entire career, we had a nursing shortage. And so being able to address the issue of education, high quality education at scale, was also part of that mission. So I found myself on a very steep learning curve, learning about competency-based education and traveling around the country and talking to people all over the country about competency-based education and what we were going to do at WGU, what we were doing. And I really found myself at odds with almost every nurse educator in the country at that time, 18 years ago. It was not a well-received message.
I can imagine.
I'm very gratified, though, that 15 years later, AACN embraced competency-based education. In fact, CCNE has incorporated it in the standards and other accreditors as well. So clearly, the message began to resonate with people, but it was a bit of a tough row in the beginning.
Well, you mentioned AACN having incorporated the competencies, their 2021 essentials, and certainly other accrediting bodies have done the same thing. You think is the reason that this trend has finally taken hold in education and nursing specifically? What are those factors?
Well, I think it's just such a perfect fit for a practice profession. I mean, CBE is really about what students know and can do. And so that really is kind of at the heart of a practice profession. And so being able to demonstrate competencies and develop advanced competencies, it just starts to make greater sense than simply learning content. And I think learning objectives and, all the things that we've done for many years, we're really sort of laying the groundwork for competency-based education, which instead of looking at the path, it looks at the destination. If you think about the competency as being the end in mind, the pathway, the learning objectives, the content, all of those are parts of the journey, but they are not the ultimate destination. I think there's a lot of discussion now about nurses being practice ready, and that's a whole nother discussion that we could have.
Right.
But I think in that context, people are saying, hey, if we can define the competencies that a novice nurse should have upon graduation, then we can measure them and we can develop them. So I think it's just a more natural fit as people have been able to sort of wrap their heads around some of the concepts.
What do you think were the factors that made this trend more acceptable to all us nurse educators that have been nurse educators for 100 years?
Well, I think a number of things. So, for example, as we have begun to embrace new technologies like simulation, like AI, generative AI, we're starting to learn that some of the things that we focused on before are really not the things. I mean, I used to have a faculty member, I had a faculty member once who developed for me an entire course on for a women's health course, and her entire course was on the menstrual cycle. And I said to her, Marilyn, this doesn't really help the student understand what they need to know and be able to do in women's health. And she said, well, this was my research. So I think we've been sort of troubled with that in nursing education for a long time because we haven't always agreed on what it is that we're doing together. And so we've started to see that partnering differently is super important for us to be successful with learners. And I also think that when I first went to NLN 15 years ago and stood up at the microphone and talked about how we were using simulation for assessment, I practically run out of the room because simulation was seen as a tool for teaching only, no assessment. Well, now I think we've learned that simulation is the best tool we have for assessing critical thinking, decision making, and building those really complex skills. So I think as we've learned more with more technology, it just makes more sense to us.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. I think the idea of simulation and the fact that it has expanded so probably is one of those factors. You spoke a little bit about it was tough going at the beginning. And I suspect there are still people having some difficulty integrating this into their curricula. What advice would you give to those proponents of competency-based education to stay the course, if you will?
Well, I think if I could say one more thing about why this change has finally been increasingly embraced, I think we also started to see that we were measuring seat time and we were measuring hours. And when you measure time, all you're measuring is time. You're not measuring learning. And so as we started to really have, I think, increased challenges in the clinical setting, with the quality of the clinical experience that students were getting, and we were seeing that variability, and one student might have to stand up against the wall and watch, whereas another student might actually be able to do hands-on, and that depended on, the nurses in the room, it depended on the facility and their policies. I mean, there were so many variables that as educators, we were increasingly frustrated that those clinical hours didn't really mean that much. And we needed to think about learning, not hours. So I think all of those things have started to coalesce, if you will, and people start to think, oh, wait a minute, I don't really like what's happening there for my students. I don't think they're building enough competence and confidence. So having X number of clinical hours is not the goal. That can't be the learning goal that we're targeting. And so nurse educators are pretty smart. And I think over time, we just get more and more information. We think, hey, maybe this way will be better for us. So, to your second part of your question, I think the key here is there's lots of resources that are out there now that were not there, were not available 10, 15 years ago.
That's right.
One of the resources that I'll talk about that I had the great honor and privilege to be a part of was the NLN strategic vision work on competency-based education. And so we came together I guess it's been about a year and a half ago with a really diverse group And again, this is a great way to write competencies. Get a diverse group, get educators, people from practice, students, vendors, get everybody in the room talking about what is the endpoint that we're trying to get to and how are we going to measure it. So the NLN came up with this statement, which I think is a very aspirational and inspirational way to think about CBE. And I'm just going to read it here. CBE hold promise for being able to lift and shift education beyond traditions of credit hours, clinical hours, and grades into a new, more fluid future of confident, competent, new graduate nurses at all levels of entry and practice who will feel prepared and will be prepared to persist in high quality nursing practice across their careers. So every time I've shared that with nurse educators, they have applauded because they see themselves in there. They see, yes, this is it. This is what we're trying to do. We want nurses who are confident and competent. We want them to stay in the profession. How do we get there? So I would say that, and since we did that strategic vision and all that basic work, the NLN has developed a lovely toolkit to help people path, pretty comprehensive, and I highly recommend that. And there are other resources that I think are really helping. Marilyn, I can't think of her last name right now, but she is a national expert on assessment methodology. She started in the simulation world, but she sort of expanded beyond that, all the different ways that we can measure and measuring learning, not time. So I think there's a lot more resources out there and there's a lot more willingness to bring diverse groups together for the conversation to determine what those core competencies are.
That is a very good answer to that question. And for our listeners, we will put some links on Collaborative Momentum Consulting's website for it, just as Jan was discussing. So thank you very much for that. In sort of the same vein as we've been talking, let me ask this question. I know that many of the programs in nursing still are bound by traditional semesters or terms or whatever words they use. And so I know that you have talked in terms, I've heard you in other times talking about not necessarily be bound by those kind of structures. And so I would just ask, as we move forward, what are your recommendations to those of us who are still in a traditional system and may not have the opportunity to make any changes in terms of that? How would you suggest that those folks use competency-based in those environments where it's, fall, spring, and summer terms?
Right. Well, I mean, the answer is kind of complex, I'll say that, because again, instead of having, I would say that one of the key opportunities here in a time-bound system is just think about how to use the time differently. So one of the things that I think we've mistakenly done is we've done like high stakes assessment at the end of a program or at the end of a course.
Yep.
So if we think instead about collecting individualized student data all the way along during that 15-week term, and moving students at their own pace quickly towards the competencies. And that means having lots of different kinds of assessment and lots of different opportunities. And it also means that the students have greater transparency about what it is they're trying to achieve. I know, probably having been an educator for many years, you've never had a student say, will this be on the test? Well,
Absolutely.
That's a passive student, right?
All right.
Not an active learner. They're looking for that A or that B or whatever. And so what we have to do is shift that mindset, activate those learners and say, look, we're all headed to destination and we're going to help you get there. And we're going to give you these multiple assessments along the way so you can see if you're there or not. And that's a way I think you can activate the learner in a fixed time set, but you have to think about using the time differently. So it's a little more complicated than that. Hopefully you're kind of getting the gist here, which is, I think the other thing is faculty roles really are different. So in traditional models, the faculty does everything, right? You write the curriculum, you write the assessments, you grade them, you give the lectures, you decide what the curriculum includes, all of that, you do it all. But if you think about having your faculty specialize, so maybe you have an assessment specialist and their whole job is to figure out how to measure the competencies you've developed and the multiple ways that those competencies can be assessed. Then maybe you have a faculty role that specialization is coaching. And what they're doing is looking at individual student data and coaching students individually toward the competencies. Then maybe you have a faculty role that's just grading. And all they do is develop the rubric and grade the assessments so there's no bias. When you start to unbundle the faculty role, and we did this at Western Governors, and the first time CCNE came to visit me, and they looked at that unbundled faculty role, they were not impressed. But then they came back at the end meeting and said, "Why is your faculty so happy?" And I said, "You need to ask them, first of all, ask them that question, don't ask me." But I think what you have to consider is sometimes you can't be an expert on everything. You can't be a really good assessment maker and a really good counselor guider and a really good grader and a really good competency developer. And you can't be good at everything. But if you have a core group of people who are committed to an endpoint, you can say, look, let me take this part. I can do this. Let me take that part. I can do this. So that's one way that you can approach that fixed timeline of semesters is just use your resources differently.
Your response to that question was great, and it gives us all food for thought about different ways of doing things. As our last question here, I would ask you to give us all, as we see this changing environment, and it's exciting and interesting, but it is somewhat stressful. So what final advice would you give to all of us who are struggling with this change?
Well, I would say the first thing I would say is let's all agree on what it is that we're trying to do. I mean, if we come from a shared place of belief that we're really, really committed to developing the nursing graduate of the future who can not only navigate this complex world of practice, but also do it with a sense of commitment and a lifelong career approach. If that's our goal, if we have that shared goal, I think when going gets tough, you always kind of come back. What is it in Princess Bride? The guy says, "Oh, always go back to the beginning if you get lost." So you start with that shared principle. What is our shared principle? What is our belief? What is it that we're going to power through this, and this is what's going to lift us as we're powering through the hard times. The other thing I would say is, and I mentioned before, there are resources out there. I think using the resources, I think giving people education about competency-based education so that they're actually getting grounded in the science of the work before they start taking on these major system problems. That really helps. And I think sometimes people think, oh, I know what it is. I know, I got this. But I think it's better to really start fresh with fresh eyes and really go through an education process that everybody is sort of level set on as you're starting to make these changes. And then the last thing I would say is partnering with everybody. So now you're partnering with your practice partners, with your vendors, with your students, with each other. And so, really breaking down any silos that may exist and just saying, look, we got to all be in this conversation together because there are multiple perspectives that are going to help us get to that one shared belief at the end. So, I think it's important to have some fun along the way. We tried to celebrate even the most minor success because, it helped lift the group and say, oh yeah, okay, we still got some more in the tank. We can keep going. And I think being able to enlarge that group of people that you're celebrating with also helps.
That's a really good piece of advice, and one who likes a party as well as anybody else. I think that probably will keep us all in the right path. Jan, thank you so much. This was such fun, and we appreciate very much your doing this. We'll call you again, and I hope everyone will look at your article and all the things you've done as a way to continue their learning as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Susie. It's been a real delight to see you again and to talk about this important topic.